incredible ways. I'm going to ask everybody to turn off to mute yourself, if you would. We have a really great turnout today. Caitlin and I had to face the question of whether or not we were going to upgrade the kind of membership we had in Zoom, because when we said we were going to do a virtual pies and charts, you guys all jumped in and we had over 100 people immediately. And so we are so excited to be able to get a premium subscription to Zoom so that we could welcome all of our friends. It's really great fun to scroll down and see everybody. It would be so much more fun to actually be there with you, not just because the pie tastes better, but also because it would just be good to see all of you. I know that that many of us are feeling very hungry for sort of the kind of interaction that we get at events like Pies and Charts. So I want to welcome you all here. Carol Hedges with the Colorado Fiscal Institute. We're going to do our best today to kind of update you, kind of act like it's a real live Pies and Charts. I brought my piece of pie. I don't know if you guys did or not. It's a summer berry pie that we made over the weekend. It's quite delicious. So thank you so much for coming, and we really hope everybody's doing all right and staying healthy. We've got a lot of stuff to deal with today, to talk about today. So let me just go over a couple of kind of weird Zoom rules, right? We're all getting good at this. One, try to keep your microphone on mute. If you don't have yours on mute, you make noise, it makes it harder for everybody else to hear. So really would appreciate it if you could do that. We're gonna have time for questions at the end. Our party master, Caitlin, has got us all organized and ready to go. So if you can see there that you can raise your hand if you have a question, or you can type into the chat box. And we're going to kind of go through the presentations and then take questions at the end, so that we can, because there's so many of us that we felt like that was the best way to manage this conversation. It's a challenging, difficult time for all of us. I've been, as we all have been, paying attention to budget cuts, and I just did a presentation for the Colorado Nonprofit Association, and I got handed a softball of a question from my friend Mark Turner about how this was could lead to a point where people really began to understand the importance of public investments and make different decisions. And all I could do was be depressed about it. So I apologize to Mark about not handling that. But I think he and Rennie were right that this really is an opportunity. For the first time in a long time, people are really, it's been laid bare how important public investments are, how important it is, what our government does is to our well-being in our communities and individually. So for the evening is going to be, as Caitlin says, one part May revenue forecast. We get to leave the really depressing stuff to our friend Chris Stifler. 2 parts Colorado budget. He gets to give us a double dose, a double-sized piece of pie of all the things that we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of years. We're going to have a one heaping spoonful of short-term solutions. There's going to be several of us that are going to talk about some of the things that are still alive in legislature, and then we're going to need into long-term solutions, and we're going to end on a high note talking about the possibility of making structural reform to deal with the inequities in our tax code, as well as to better fund public services going forward. Let's hope it doesn't quite get to 400 degrees, but we do want everybody to get cool and also get involved. So that's the way we're going to end tonight, and we're going to jump in now. And I think, Caitlin, unless I'm mistaken, we're going to turn this right over to Chris.
That's right.
Yeah, Caitlin, next slide. Okay, yeah. So normally we talk about, audio good? Normally we talk about the June revenue estimates because the economists at the Ledge Council do an estimate every 3 months, except the March revenue estimate was a week before lockdown, so they had no idea of the economic disaster that was gonna happen in the revenue estimates. So we had a special revenue estimate a couple weeks ago. If you go back one slide, Caitlin, to articulate the economic damage that happened, I pulled up the unemployment rate in Colorado just to show you the unemployment spike. We went from 2.5% unemployment 2 months ago to 11.3% unemployment. Just to give that context of the last economic recessions, we were at about 5% unemployment when Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and the financial crisis kicked off in 2008, and we didn't get to about 9% unemployment till 2 years later. So we've well exceeded the Great Recession's unemployment by more than 2% unemployment. So huge swiftness in the spike of unemployment. Next slide. Now how that affects the state budget is most of the state budget, our general fund, comes from income tax and sales tax. So when everyone loses their jobs, they're not paying income tax and they're not buying stuff. So we've had a drastic drop in revenue collections. Here's the projections over the next 2 years from fiscal year 18-19. And if these bars were reversed, you'd think we'd have a good budget, growing by about 7%, except it's going the opposite direction. We're falling by 7%, we're falling by 11%. So we're going from having about $13.2 billion budget in revenue collections in 18 to 10.8 billion for the budget we're trying to write this week. If you articulate that in budgetary spending terms, if you basically look at what we spent in this year's budget and compare it to as we're writing next year's budget, we're $3.3 billion short of what we just appropriated last year. That's a 25% revenue shortfall. And that doesn't even account for the fact that there's caseload growth, there's population growth, there's inflation to cover. We couldn't pay for the 18-19, but the 19-20 budget. We were short $3.3 billion. Next slide. So think about in context, here's last year's pie, budgetary pie. About 36% of the state budget goes to schools. Another 26 goes to Medicaid and healthcare. Think about how you would shed 25%. That's almost the entire healthcare budget. You could basically shed all of human services, all of corrections, and all of higher education to get 25%. It is a massive chunk of the state budget. And so some highlights of what they've been talking about in the JBC the last several weeks, and they're going to debate on the floor in the House this week, is where do those big $1 billion worth of cuts come from? I think we've seen that a lot of it's going to come from higher education and K-12 education. We're looking at close to a $600 million cut from the higher education budget, which is almost 30% of the higher ed's state appropriation. I think we're looking at about $450 million cut from the K-12 education system. So that basically moves our negative factor. If you really follow the in-depth analysis of school finance, that's almost going to double our negative factor above $1 billion again. The homestead exemption, which is a property tax break for seniors, if they're 65 and older and stayed in their homes for 10 years, that's about $160 million the state pays to give a property tax break to seniors. That's going to be chopped. I think we'll take down our savings account. So right now we have a 7.25% general fund reserve. We'll have to dip into that, and I think the current projections look like we'll dip into our reserve into about the 3.5% range. So similar to what we did in the Great Recession, where we really ran our reserve down to about 2-3% as a way to cut a bunch of money to allocate for next year's budget. Next slide. And so as that's not dismal enough, we're talking about 25% cut in the state budget. To put the icing on the cake, there's my pie pun that Caitlin made me do. Cities and counties also are being devastated. If you look at our heavily reliance on sales tax, we're at the third highest. When you talk about sales tax, we rely very heavily on local sales taxes. The third highest in the country, and most of that revenue goes and pays for the general fund for cities and counties. So when we're talking about our tourism and leisure hospitality has been decimated. I think Ledge Council had some stats that said leisure hospitality and tourism is down like 80% year over year from last year. You cut all that out from the Montroses and the Tellurides and the Urays and the Blackhawks of Colorado, and you're just devastating the sales tax collections for those cities and counties. So that's another dismal side of the whole budget pie. Is we're about $3.3 billion short in the state budget and several $billion short in the city and county budgets. And to layer on more negative news is the Gallagher Amendment is back in the news again, affecting our state budgets and are going to really hurt our fire districts, because the massive drop in oil and gas that came with this recession basically means we can't collect as much money from our property tax on homes because of the Gallagher Amendment. And so in times where we're decimating cities and counties through sales tax, we're also going to give a massive 18% cut to homeowners in property tax. So it's a very, very bleak, bleak budgetary, not sweet. Is that a pun? Is that a pun, Caitlin? Outlook. Next slide. And so I'll reserve questions on specific budgetary stuff toward the end. I think I'm going to pass the baton back over to Carol or Raina to talk about some short-term solutions.
Okay, so it's me. Hi, for those of you who have not met me before, my name is Raina Hetledge. I am the health policy analyst at CFI. So I'm just going to talk about a couple different bills that I've been working on over the last legislative session. The first one is the health insurance provider fee. So to try to, it can get really nerdy and wonky, but to try to keep it very high level, this is a fee that is currently being charged on health insurance providers at the federal level. It's from the Affordable Care Act, and it'll sunset on January 1st of 2021 at the federal level. And so there's an initiative to implement this fee as a Colorado fee, and so that we can collect that money. I put on here an estimate of 100 to 140 million, but I'm now seeing that our estimates went up to 160 million of how much we would expect to collect from that. And that money would be used to help fund reinsurance moving forward. For those who don't know, the reinsurance program was only funded for 2 years. And so we do not have a continuous funding source for it. It would fund a state wrap to help cover insurance for people who are in certain groups, and as well as expansion of subsidies to people who are in groups that are not currently covered under subsidies through the Affordable Care Act. And the next one. And then the other group of bills that I've been working on is part of this air toxics coalition that's trying to address air and water pollution in our state. I think most people have looked outside and see that this is a huge problem, especially in the metro area, but a lot of places around the state have this issue of high air and water pollution. So there's a set of 3 bills that are looking to address this issue. The first one is HB 1143, which would increase the fee for violating air and water pollution from our current amount, which is about $10,000–$15,000 per violation, up to the federal maximum, which is a little bit less than $55,000 per day per violation. Then there's HB 1265, which would create a notification system that would tell community members and people and workers when air quality air toxics are exceeding the limits. And then this one actually just was introduced right before session ended, so I haven't worked a ton on it, but is Senate Bill 204, which would create an air quality enterprise to manage air quality emissions and standards.
Cool. Kathy, I think you're next.
Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathy White. I'm the Deputy Director at the Colorado Fiscal Institute. And I will talk about my labor of love, paid family and medical leave. It has been a CFI priority for many years, and we've been an active part of the coalition that's been trying to pass paid family and medical leave for quite a while. I think with the COVID, we tried again this year, ran into quite a lot of opposition from the governor's office, surprisingly. With COVID, I think you can see that paid family and medical leave and paid sick leave are more important than ever, and the need has been really recognized across the state and the country. But even with that demonstrated need, the governor's opposition to a universal social insurance program that would make sure that every worker in Colorado had access to paid family and medical leave meant that the sponsors didn't feel like they could get this bill through this year. So they have decided to pivot to the ballot and support a ballot initiative for paid family and medical leave. They are taking up a paid sick leave, a smaller paid sick leave bill that was introduced last night. That bill is going to provide 48 hours for a full-time worker, or an equivalent for a part-time worker, of paid sick days paid for by the employer. And that is likely to get through, even though there was going to probably be quite a bit of opposition to it. It would provide more leave in times of a public health pandemic, like we are experiencing today. And then the paid family and medical leave, which is a longer leave, creates a social insurance program, something that CFI has been advocating for a long time, will be decided by voters in November. Colorado will be the first state to ever run a paid family and medical leave ballot initiative. And even though the support is very high, the stakes are also very high if it were to fail for the national effort. So the Colorado's Family First filed a bunch of different titles. They, I think, are narrowing in on the one that they're going to petition. And there's a link here in the on the slide for Colorado Families First, where you can go and learn more about the paid leave ballot initiative, and also get involved.
Hey, thanks, Kat. There's some questions that we'll come back to at the end. We're just going to try to get through the presentation, but we see the questions in the chat. Also, I just saw that Elliot, thank you, Elliot, posted the website there that Kathy had in her slide. She posted it in the chat. So take a look at your chat if you're interested in going there. I'm going to pick up here with the Helping Colorado Families Get Ahead Act. This is a bill that CFI has been actively involved with, or an effort for, I don't know, Kathy, like since Kathy and I were children. And it is actually about expanding the earned income tax credit and making sure that the earned income tax credit is available to lots of different folks and is meaningful, is a meaningful benefit to Colorado families. I saw Shar on the list too. She too has been an important part of this effort over the years. And prior to the adoption of prior to the pandemic, the spread of COVID, we'd worked in coalition to get to draft HB 1203, which expanded the current EITC to 20% of the federal benefit from where it is now, which is 10% of the federal benefit. In addition, 1203 funded the child tax credit, which is a provision that was added to the statute back in 2013, but was never actually funded. The pre-COVID bill would have started the funding for those two measures with tax year 2021. The sort of doing what it is that we've learned to do over the years, we found to pay for. This wasn't going to be something that was going to cost additional general fund money. We had identified a tax loophole created in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was adopted in 2017, I think. 17, Chris, give me a nod. Was it 17? We were planning to use that to close that loophole. As many of you know, Colorado's tax code is linked to changes in the federal tax code, and we were going to decouple from that federal change and use that money to fund the EITC expansion as well as pay for the child tax credit. Now, in our COVID environment, it is anticipated that House Bill 1203 will die in House Appropriations Committee. It will die because its title no longer would allow it to sort of do the things that we were going to need it to do under this circumstance. And, you know, sometimes when you have good ideas, people appropriate them. And that's exactly what happened here. We identified a funding source, and now that is going to be a funding source that if the deal that's in the works comes to fruition, it will be at the dollars from that closing that tax loophole will be added to the general fund for the next couple of years to help offset cuts to K-12 education and higher education and child care and Medicaid and all of the other important priorities. The deal would also, so it would use that money, like I said, for budget balancing in 20 and 21. But then it would pay for an expansion of the EITC starting in fiscal year 22. Hopefully, again, this deal is very much in the works. It would include ITIN filers. That's the folks who are, those are taxpayers who are paying taxes to both federally and in the state that don't have a social security number. They tend to be immigrants. And currently, even though they're paying into the tax system, they aren't eligible for the EITC benefit here in the state of Colorado. And so we are hoping to include that group of people in the EITC going forward. It's particularly important now as those taxpayers have also been left out of most of the federal aid that's been made, that's available to many of us, either the direct economic assistance along with many of the other benefits. If you are an ITIN or a filer or in a family with an ITIN filer, you don't get those benefits. And so we're hoping through the new version of the tax credit bill, we'll be able to extend that benefit to Coloradans who really need it the most. Unfortunately, at this point, it looks like we're once again going to be not funding the child tax credit. This is one of those things that, Kathy had to work for, 30 years to get the EITC funded the first time. She's got another 30 maybe, unfortunately, to make sure that the CTC gets funded. But I'm confident that we're going to get there eventually. The good news about this bill is that it is a high priority for legislators. It has remained on the list of options going forward when so many of the important priorities have fallen away. And it's because it really is one of the best poverty reduction programs that we have in the country. And it also is due to the incredible coalition and sponsors that have come together to make this something that people really understand how important it is. They understand how it works. And we are really optimistic and hopeful that one of the things that's going to make it to the finish line in this interrupted 2020 session is an expansion of the earned income tax credit. Even though it's not going to start when we want it to, we need to get it on the books because we have actually seen a future EITC funding mechanism work to bring relief to families. And so that's what we're hoping is going to happen here. I think, Caitlin, I'm ready for the next one. I want to talk a little bit about another effort that has sprung to life during our stay-at-home period of interacting with one another. Can you go back? Thank you. And that's the emergency tax. And one of the things that I want to start this conversation about emergency tax by talking about what I call the equation of need. Because I think an awful lot of our attention when we're talking about the costs associated with the health pandemic is focused only on one part of this equation. And when we're really trying to understand the magnitude of need that's out there, I think it's important that we consider all of these boxes. The first one really is just focused on the cost of increased services. Those are direct costs. We're seeing them in our universities as they've adapted to online learning, in our K-12 education system as teachers are having to figure out how to interact with students virtually and making sure that everybody has the equipment that they need, and our schools are making sure that kids are being fed, and there's just and our hospitals are adapting to having patients that are highly contagious interface with patients that are having babies, all of those things. There's really are a ton of really just direct costs that sometimes when we're talking about like federal assistance or budget problems, we don't factor that in, but it's a huge amount of money. I haven't seen a precise estimate. I haven't been able to get anybody to give me a quotable estimate, but then the number I've heard messed around with is between $700 and $800 million. That's a lot of money. And so I think it really has to be considered when we think about the costs that the state and our local governments are undertaking right now. Then obviously is the middle box. Chris talked about that. We're talking about a $3.3 billion loss in revenue just at the state level. And that comes just basically from just stomping on the brakes on the economy. And also there's a little bit of the impact there that is because of what's happening worldwide with oil and gas production. But that is the big one. That's the one we talk about a lot. And it's, let $3.3 billion added to, I don't know, 800 million. Now we're at $4.1 billion. And then there's still this other amount of money out there that I don't think people are thinking about either. This situation does not solve itself overnight. It's not like tomorrow everybody goes back to work and all the individuals who are unemployed suddenly have jobs and they're back to buying stuff, or that our communities, that Chris did a really great job of talking about, many of our communities haven't even begun to really feel the impact directly on their budgets because they get so much of their money from sales taxes that come into them in the summer. And I don't know about you, but I'm not anxious to jump on an airplane. Even as we do sort of lift some of those restrictions. So those communities haven't even begun to understand or feel or still waiting for the impact of a lot of that delayed economic activity to work its way through their budgets. And of course, there's still a lot of folks that are behind the door on some of the direct aid to business. And again, I don't have a good number here, but to try to fill in gaps for individuals who may need additional unemployment benefit beyond the time that the current system is set up, we just don't know. So my big point here is that there's just still a big number out there. And those are the things that the state is really facing as we think forward about what the budget impact is going to be. Kate, I'm ready now for the next slide. And interestingly enough, Tabor, you guys know about that, right? The Tabor Amendment actually contemplates an emergency. And in fact, it has a section that talks specifically about emergencies. Now, it is Tabor, and so it is not easy or clear about what it exactly means. But it does recognize and acknowledge that there are certain circumstances where more money for government is important and needed. Now, having said that, it doesn't make it easy. In order for the legislature to authorize their emergency powers, and that is primarily to enact a tax increase without prior voter approval, they need two two-thirds votes. One is to declare an emergency, and that emergency, of course, can't be economic related. I mean, that would make too much sense. It only has to be a tax in a time when it's not an economic emergency. Well, as odd as that might sound, our current situation is exactly that presentation, right? We have a health emergency that has economic consequences. And it would be really helpful to be able to have additional tax dollars at this point to help offset some of the costs that I identified when I was talking about that equation of need. So it takes a 2/3 to declare the emergency, and then it takes 2/3 to adopt a tax. And then that tax money can only be used after we've depleted the Tabor emergency reserves. Now, Tabor emergency reserves are like so many things in Tabor. They're kind of head scratching. They're the only savings account I've ever heard of that once you use it, you have to pay it back by the end of the year. Now, I don't know about you, but my husband and I are, we're pretty good about saving for things. And, we want to put a new, update the backyard. So we put away a little money, and we get the pile of money that we need in order to do the changes that we want, and then we spend it. We don't have to then fill it back up again by the end of the year. If you have to do that, it makes it irrelevant to an emergency, right? It undermines what its purpose is. Well, of course, that's what you have to do with the Tabor Emergency Reserve. So it's really not very helpful, but it does have to be depleted. Interestingly enough, because the legislature's figured out it's not very helpful, they have identified buildings as part of what's in that reserve. That reserve is equal to 3% of fiscal year spending. So we have buildings sitting there. Well, if the legislature were to adopt an emergency tax, all they'd have to do is redesignate that emergency reserve to be a cash amount, and identify that it had been used. And I am absolutely confident. In fact, I've talked to legislators and staff about how that could happen. Whatever tax gets adopted or would be considered needs to raise a substantial amount of revenue. And it needs to, without making things worse, right? I mean, it doesn't do any good to adopt an emergency tax on sales when our sales are so depressed it's not generating enough money to support public services going forward. So there, that would lead us to an income tax kind of a solution. There are ways to make that happen, to adopt an emergency tax that would be a tax on income. But we're really struggling with our legislative supporters and our legislators to find someone who's willing to take on this responsibility, primarily because of running this bill and trying to get the emergency votes, primarily because they're worried about whether or not that 2/3, there's any way they can put together a coalition of 2/3 of our legislators to support it. The other thing I want to say about it is that it would be temporary. It would only be in effect through the end of November of 2020, which is in some ways good for getting the 2/3, but is somewhat bad in actually helping us avoid tax cuts or budget cuts. And so that's sort of where we are with that's the explanation of the emergency tax. I want to give a shout out to our friends at CCLP, who have been leading an effort to get advocates to raise their voices together in the need for additional revenue. And within about 10 days, about some over 130 organizations signed a letter in support of an emergency tax and have sent it to legislators and to the executive branch. As I said, we haven't had thousands of people interested in stepping into sponsorship role. In fact, so far, no one has actually stepped up, although there continues to be, because of this strong advocacy effort, legislators who are expressing interest and trying to figure out if it's something that they can, that they feel like they can spend their time moving forward with. I think that's all I've got on short-term solutions. Caitlin, are you ready to start talking about the need for long-term solutions?
I am. Thanks, Carol. Hi, everyone. I'm Party Master Caitlin, also known as the Outreach Director for the Colorado Fiscal Institute. And, now more than ever, we need both. You know what? I have a ghost in my house that keeps advancing slides without me pressing buttons. But, here's the punchline. So now more than ever, we heard our staff talk about these short-term efforts that are in place right now, but I want to talk about the long-term solutions that can help our communities recover. CFI and many of our partners, some of them on this Zoom call, and hopefully all of you soon, look, it's doing it again, are supporting the effort called Fair Tax Colorado, Initiative 271, and trying to get it on the ballot this fall. And we need all the support we can get. So I'd love to chat with you guys about this effort and what 271 does. Initiative 271, it creates a graduated income tax that raises the income tax rates for the top 5% of Colorado earners and lowers the tax rates for everyone else. It would generate up to $2 billion in new revenue for Colorado. And so these next few slides are kind of the 5 main things that 271 does. So the first step to 271, once we get it on November's ballot and once it gets put in place January 2021, the first step would be to repeal our constitutional requirement for a single rate income tax. And then we would put into statute a new graduated income tax structure that, like I said before, increases income rates on all income above $250,000. And on this chart, here is the new tax table that it would put in place. So you see that new tax rate for all income under $250,000 would change from the 4.63% we have now to 4.58%. And then gradually increase for all income above $250,000 to the highest rate of 8.9% for any income above $1 million. There is accountability in 271. It would create a fair tax commission that would be made up of 25 folks who would report to the governor, the General Assembly, and the public on the effects of the new fair tax structure, looking at state revenue, funding for public services, income distribution, and the business climate. So we know how we would raise that $2 billion of new revenue. This new revenue would be voter approved, meaning it's not subject to the Tabor cap. So 50% of that new revenue would go to retain, recruit, and pay teacher and student staff support in public education, K through 12 public education. And the other half would go to address the needs of our growing population and changing economy. And this language was used intentionally so that our legislators could have that flexibility to use the revenue where Colorado needs it most. So it can go towards things like transportation, education, higher education, public health services, all those public investments that us and all of our partners have had a long time advocating around. There's also a provision in 271 that says 90% of the revenue, of the new revenue, it must be spent on services and not administration costs. And it creates a citizens oversight committee to make sure that happens. So this effort is a citizens initiative effort, meaning we need to gather 124,632 valid signatures by August 3rd to qualify for November's ballot. Meaning we need everyone to engage in this effort. One thing I'll say is that we never thought we'd be trying to figure out how to run a signature gathering campaign in the midst of a global pandemic. And I want to stress that the campaign is putting safety as its highest priority for all of our volunteers. And right now the asks are to receive a petition by mail and asking your friends and neighbors and family to sign the petition and go out and collect those signatures as much as you feel comfortable. This can look like asking your friends and family to sign, having a pop-up signing station outside of your house while you stand 6 feet away with your mask and hand sanitizers. We have some volunteers that are creating mobile petition stations with their cars and driving to their friends and family's houses to collect signatures safely. Other ways to get involved with Fair Tax Colorado, our website, fairtaxcolorado.org, is a really awesome resource, which has a tax calculator so you can calculate your new income taxes. It has all of our fact sheets and other volunteer links where you can pledge to sign. You can sign up to get a petition mailed to you. We have Fair Tax Colorado is putting on 3 webinars a week for anyone who wants to learn more how to get involved. We also are pushing out that we can do a presentation for you and your organization if you haven't had it already, or gather a group of friends for your book club and do a virtual presentation about Fair Tax Colorado and learn how you can get involved. We also are on social media. So right now, I would ask all of you to click on the links that Elliot posted and like us on Facebook, like us on Twitter, find us on Instagram, and share our posts. We really need to make sure that everyone knows about this effort and knows how to get engaged. I also want to talk about Fair Tax Day On Saturday, June 13th, the Fair Tax Colorado Outreach Group has decided that we wanted to create our own event, as summertime in Colorado usually is a really great time to go to events and collect signatures, but we can't do that. So we want to create our own event. We're asking organizations and all of our volunteers to join us in creating these pop-up signing stations where we ask folks, family and friends, to come and sign our petitions, and we are going to ask everyone who has pledged to sign to find one of these pop-up stations in their neighborhoods or in their area and go and sign the petition on that day. So we're hoping to make Saturday, June 13th, Fair Tax Day. I'm really encouraging all of you to get involved in this important effort. We need everyone who's able to get involved to help make sure that we create a fair tax in Colorado. With that, I think we have time for questions, and I'll turn it over to Elliot and Louise if there's questions in the chat, and Carol as well. So feel free to either raise your hand and we can call on you for questions. We can also, you can unmute yourself and ask them, or chat them away and we will make sure we get to them.
Hi, everyone. My name is Louise, and I'll be reading the questions today. It looks like there's been a few questions asked here. First, one we saw come up was from Robert Brocker, and this is specifically, it sounds like, for Chris. It asks, have you calculated the net effect of the Gallagher rate reduction to residential versus zeroing out the senior property tax exemption?
Oh yeah, so the senior property tax exemption this year is about 160 million. The Gallagher amendment only impacts local property taxes, so it really hits fire districts, ambulance districts, cities and counties that have the local property tax, but it also impacts the state budget through the school finance formula, because about a third of our school finance is local property taxes. So if you look at the impact of dropping the RAR from 7.15 to 5.8, it's about an 18% reduction in the value of our homes we can tax. Multiply that by the mills that are supposed to be paid to your school districts, and it's about a collective 250 million hit to the state budget. That's just the state budget. So the state budget basically has to backfill 250 million for that property tax cut. In addition, all those mill levy overrides and bond mills that are based on your assessed value, that's another probably 200 some million dollars estimated. So it's a big hit to the school budget, about $500 million worth of hit to just the school budget. And that doesn't even touch the drops in funding for your fire districts and your library districts and your ambulance districts.
Chris, Louise, I'm just going to jump in here for a second. Chris, it's my understanding that those impacts aren't going to actually show up for a while, right? I mean, can you talk a little bit about how the reduction in the residential assessment rate is sort of creates this longer tail for our economic problems?
Yeah, so it's not really going to be felt in this year's coming budget. We reassess property every 2 years. So it's going to be the 2021 reassessment that will lower the RAR. So I don't think that will really flow into maybe 2021, 22 state budgeting year. Yeah, so it's down the road, another thing that's coming.
Another question we had from Alexandra Lyons, and it sounds like there was a similar question from Joe Wilson on and I think this is for Kathy and Carol, just what was the governor's rationale on, not supporting paid leave and sick policy, and just, it sounded like it kind of went against what he was saying about, protecting workers and trying to incentivize people not to go to work while sick.
You take that one, Kath.
I don't know. I honestly can't say, because yeah, I just don't know. His main point has been that he would prefer any paid family and medical leave policy to be paid by employers and not managed by the state, and offered through private insurance companies rather than administered by a state agency. He's pretty firm on those.
The next question that we had was from Rendell Loeb. Forgive me, I hope that's the correct pronunciation. He talked about
That's right.
Lieb. Okay. So the question was, people of color are being lost at a level that is unfathomed. Rural areas are being decimated at this point. The overall impact of this fiscal crisis wears more heavily on vulnerable populations. What can be done to help alleviate the disaster on the groups mentioned?
Well, Randall, I think it's a great point, and it's important that we always remember that while the health emergency has an effect on all of us, it's very different depending upon your circumstance, and some pretty random reasons. It's not shared equally, and I think that's one of the things that is important about and why so many people are engaged in the emergency tax effort. Death is not something that can be compensated for, right? You can't pay someone for those kinds of for that kind of an outcome, but we can do things that provide better access to healthcare. We can provide more equitable access to the kinds of privileges that many of us have, not having to go to work if we're vulnerable or if we're compromised in some way, that we would have the resources that would be available to have a shelter and be able to buy and have access to food and healthy, a lifestyle that would protect us the most we possibly could. I mean, I don't know that that there's anything that is going to that's going to be able to level or equalize exactly the cost, but I know that the price of this thing, but I know that that's one of the really powerful things about the emergency tax. If we had additional revenue, we could do things to make sure that people were able to stay in their homes. We could make sure that people had better access and there was more equitable access to healthcare and food and cash, quite frankly. I think that's a really important part of 271 is that we will be, not only will it be making the tax code fairer so that people of higher income will be paying a closer, more similar share of their income to low and moderate income families, but it will also provide the resources so that we can do some of the things that can offset and can really take real steps in unwinding some of the bias that's built into our system that's resulted in these outcomes. And I think that, there's nothing that I know that one of the things that I'm finding most tragic when I'm looking at budget cuts is that what we're losing are the things that we've adopted most recently. And we've just in the last 3 to 4 years, really been focused on the notion of undoing things that are part of a structural bias or a structural racism or a institutionalized bias. And the budgeteers, for legitimate sort of reasons, but that it's easier to get rid of the new things, right? Things that aren't fully implemented, things that haven't been around for a long time. And as I watch that list of budget cuts, so many of the things that we're losing are things that will go to address the kinds of inequities that you've raised.
So we have another question from Catherine Carson. And that is, what is the final JBC recommendation regarding Medicaid cuts?
Raina, can you take that one?
Oh man. I have to go back and look. So I know that one of the things that came up was cutting CHIP, and I don't know if Chris knows this, but one of the things that came up was potentially cutting funding for CHIP, and that is not happening. But I will go double check what happened with that and get back to you.
So there was another question by Randall Lieb, and it's related to what's happening in California, in that they're working on legislation on housing as a right, and he's wondering how can we talk about how we may be able to invest in people being safe during this time.
I think that's what, again, most of the conversations about the need for revenue is to have the ability to invest in personal safety and family safety for folks all across the state. I think that it is a characteristic of our system that we don't do a very good job of thinking of housing as a right. And I know that this is one of the areas where I've seen progress being rolled back. There were revenue sources that were to roll into providing additional affordable housing opportunities that have now been taken just to balance the budget, just to make sure that we're able to keep the operations of our schools and child care services, et cetera, open and available. And I would advocate once more that your voice about what those impacts are going to be on communities that you care about is really valuable. And it's what our elected officials need to hear right now.
So Kathy had forwarded a question from someone in the group, and it was, I think this is for you, Carol, why is remote education an added direct cost in the frame that you had given about the emergency tax?
So there's a lot of reasons, and I would love to kick this to somebody else who's more familiar with all of the, we've got some school folks here, but what I've been told are things like trying to make sure that all the kids have the appropriate equipment so that they can actually be getting instruction in their homes. That's true for a lot of teachers as well. There's a lot, we have places throughout Colorado that barely have a functioning internet system. And so getting buying the kind of technology that allows teachers to use this kind of technology platform, and for people to have the hardware and have the training to be able to actually make that learning happen are some of the examples that I've heard about. There's also many of the educators and the expenses of the schools that are increasing are things trying to get nutrition services and trying to get food to kids who are dependent upon school lunches and school breakfasts to make sure that they're getting the calories and the kinds of food that they need in order to sustain themselves. Those are some of the examples. I don't know if anybody else has any other kinds of examples about increased costs that they want to share.
They also, I can just say this from personal experience, that they, for my son's school anyway, they have had to move all of their math tutorials and science projects onto platforms and modules that allow for data privacy and all of that kind of stuff. And so I'm sure that they are contracting with things like Edgenuity and iExcel and all of these online learning platforms that they haven't had to do before. And also for professional development for teachers who are suddenly having to learn how to keep kids engaged in a remote fashion and not go crazy themselves, especially if they're parents at home. And so I do know that that's been a big cost for community colleges that are really trying to ensure that their faculty is able to shift to this online learning mode. And so that public school teachers were able to do that in the 3 weeks in Denver that they were able to do it is pretty remarkable. But I think that all of those especially are going to be increased cost, and it's not like they got rid of all of their capital needs, right? They still have buildings that need to be maintained and secure and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that it's just right at this moment, they have a lot of the costs that they've had before and a lot of new costs that they need going forward.
And I know that the other thing that a lot of the school districts are contemplating now is, as they think about the fall and bringing kids back and social distancing and arranging classrooms in a way that would be safe, and arranging transportation that would be safe. I think there's actually, again, I think there's a significant cost to adjusting to doing things differently.
We have a question from Apple, and it sounded like this is in regards to the governor's decision about emailing ballot initiative signatures. And she was wondering, what is the status of that at this moment in time?
Kate, you want me to take that one?
Either
Or
way.
do you want to? So there was just a decision this afternoon. So the governor issued an executive order changing slightly the rules, recognizing the emergency and changing slightly the rules on petition gathering. I've been making the joke that nothing quite like collecting 130,000 signatures in a time when it's illegal to be within 6 feet of someone you're not related to. And so as a way to sort of recognize that in addition to all the health and economic impacts, it would really be terrible to have our system of democracy undermined because of this pandemic. He issued an executive order that would allow individuals to have and to get delivered to them their homes petitions that have a single line on them, so that I could request from Fairtex, Colorado, a petition that would allow me to sign just my name. I would then be able to send that back either electronically or by mail to the campaign, and that would satisfy the requirement of a signature on a petition. That order was issued, I think, on a Wednesday, maybe, and on Friday. A Saturday. And then the next Monday, I guess it was, the Colorado Concern, a business organization here in Denver, filed suit claiming that violated the Constitution and that it was an inappropriate use of the governor's emergency powers. It was filed in a district court here in Denver just today, just moments before we started today. I think his name is Judge McGahey. Is that right? Steve Briggs, thank you for the nod. Judge McGahey issued a ruling that throughout the case did not grant the temporary restraining order throughout the Colorado Concern case. And I, in one of those wonderfully clever statements from judges that I've come to expect working with Steve Briggs all the time, Judge McGahey said that he realized he was only a speed bump on the road to justice, and that what he meant by that was he was sure that whatever decision he made was going to be appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court. That is expected to happen, and everyone expects that the Colorado Concern will appeal it. The good news is, because there was no temporary restraining order issued, the Secretary of State will be drafting the rules and regulations to implement the executive order. And so when the court, and assuming that the court decides that the governor hasn't overstepped his emergency authority, the system will be the rules will be ready for campaigns like 271 to get rolling and using this new process.
Carol, I think it's 6:33. We should honor the hour time we have allotted. So I will hand it back to you, but I just wanted to give a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. This was really surprising, a large group of you all. joining us and hearing what CFI has to say, and we really appreciate you. But I'll hand it over to Carol too.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us today. And I would really urge all of you to see if you can find a little bit of space in your own personal budgets to make a contribution. And I'm not even going to ask for a contribution to the Colorado Fiscal Institute. Kathy's like, damn you, Carol, we need the money too. And of course we do. If you want to write a check to CFI, we're happy to take it. But right now, what we really need is everybody leaning in on making sure that voters have the opportunity to decide whether we want a fairer tax system or not. This is a campaign that has been built on the commitment of organizations giving in-kind support. It continues to be a campaign that is financed by the little guys. And we would love it if you would join us in the little guys. I'm really suggesting that it's a 2020 election, so a $20 contribution would go a long way. You can find out how to make that contribution at Fair Tax Colorado. And if you're more comfortable thinking that maybe you really like pies and charts more than taxes, you can always visit coloradofiscal.org and make a contribution to our organization as well. We're looking forward to the next of our, we stand on tradition. So we will be celebrating bars and graphs at the end of the session. We will hopefully have as we have in the past, have a designated cocktail or beer that we will allow you or encourage you to make at your own home and joining us. So pay attention to emails from Caitlin, the party master, for information about bars and graphs, and that will be our wrap up of the legislative session, as well as an update on where we are with Fair Tax Colorado. I saw somebody ask a question about signatures for Fair Tax Colorado. We are in the field with a paid effort along with the volunteer efforts. We've got about 15,000 signatures in that we have now. That's a 1/10 of what we need, and we have just over 2 months to get them. So please join in that effort. Please make a contribution if you can. Please stay healthy. And stay safe. We so appreciate you, and thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, thanks.
Bye.
I'm trying to end it for all. Can't figure it out. I'm a party master. I don't ever want things to end.
Great job, everybody. Way to go.
Yeah, great job. Thanks, everyone.